Okay, this is the last section on protein for the midterm review. What you need to know about proteins in particular is that their structure is very important because structure determines their function. The structure involves the amino acids, which we think of as the building blocks of protein. And this is an example. You don't need to know the amino acids, an example of amino acids, and then linking together with a peptide bond, which is extremely strong. These strands of amino acids then coil and fold and then join together. So it forms a very complex structure, much more complex than carbohydrates or lipids. Protein can be broken down for energy. You can see it breaks down in these 2 carbon fragments, just like fat and carbohydrate, giving 4 calories per gram. But the nitrogen in it ends up being wasted. And we call this wasting because we're wasting this amino acid, which is our building block of life, and it could have been used for something else. And here are a lot of the functions of proteins. They are enzymes. They're involved in structure. If you look down at your skin, that's largely made of collagen. Think about your muscles and your cartilage and your ligaments and your tendons. All these are structural components in your body. Hormones, another example, insulin's example of a protein that's a hormone. Precursors or neurotransmitters. Antibodies, proteins are involved in fluid balance and buffers, blood clotting. And very, very lastly, they can provide energy if necessary. But we've got fat, we've got carbohydrate, we have plenty of sources of energy. We need protein for all of these important functions. So providing energy is a last resort. We think about the digestion of proteins. Remember that one of the main keys is that there's no real digestion in the mouth, but as soon as it goes into the stomach's at a very low pH. At that low pH, it starts to uncoil those proteins. So it's a very complex structure. This is an example of this complex structure that ends up kind of uncoiling and then unfolding in the stomach. As soon as it does that, it might still have the same amino acids, but it has lost its structure and therefore its function. You can see here these large strands. These are polypeptides of amino acids that then break down into dipeptides, tripeptides, and eventually single amino acids, and those are absorbed across the intestinal cells and into the bloodstream. A little bit of a closer look. In the stomach, protein uncoils, and then these are the polypeptides, the tri and dipeptides, remember 3 and 2 amino acids, and amino acids crossing into the bloodstream. So what are the recommendations? How much protein do we need? For the average person, it's 0.8 grams per kilogram. That's going to be higher for vegetarians, usually about 1 gram per kilogram. And for those who are pregnant, also if you're an athlete, you're probably up around 1.4 grams per kilogram, depending on your activity that you engage in. The only value you need to know is this 0.8 grams per kilogram. The recommendations are actually 10 to 35% of your diet of total calories. But most Americans only need 10 to 15%. So you do need to know this 10 to 15% value. I'd like to see you mention both of these on your diet study, but for the exam, I might say 10 to 15% of individual. That most Americans only need 10 to 15% of total calories from protein. Now, which proteins are best absorbed by the body? Well, it has to do with how well they're digested. And animal sources of protein are actually have higher digestibility than, say, grains. Now, legumes also are a little bit lower on the digestibility scale, except for soy products tend to be as good as animal sources as far as digestibility. Moist heat is going to increase digestibility, whereas dry heat decreases it. And my classic example that I've used multiple times is that if you take a piece of chicken and you put it on a barbecue, And then you cook it slowly over time. What's it going to get? It's going to get a little bit chewy by the time you get to it. You're going to be kind of gnawing on that to get through it. What if you took that same piece of chicken and you put it in a crock pot? A little bit of water in there, you had it cook very slowly with moist heat, and it's just going to flake right off. It's going to melt in your mouth, right? So you can see even just that's just what you're experiencing chewing, but that effect is also similar as far as the other processes of digestion. Complementary proteins is kind of the art of combining two proteins together, and these are plant-based proteins. And that's because animal protein is going to provide all of the essential amino acids. There are certain amino acids that are essential to our diet, and we have to obtain from food. The rest we can make. If we need to obtain them from food, we need to try to find the sources that provide them. So we think of an egg as one of the most perfect proteins out there. It has all the essential amino acids. Most animal proteins do. Plant, on the other hand, they really don't. So they need to be combined to make that complete protein. It doesn't have to be at the same meal. It can be, think about a 24-hour period where you want to have that variety of plant foods. And an example is looking at, here are 4 of the main amino acids, common ones that we want to combine. In legumes, you'll get the isoleucine and lysine, whereas grains will give the methionine and tryptophan. You don't need to know these amino acids at all, but know that beans and grains together are actually going to combine and make more of a complete protein. I mentioned this earlier, but when we use protein for energy and it's not used for one of its many important sources, where there's a structural component, an antibody, a buffer involved in fluid balance, or an enzymatic reaction, and we need that energy, we have to break down this protein. So here's an amino acid. This is an amino acid. And it gets broken down into these 2 carbon segments. And what happens here, we waste this nitrogen. This nitrogen is part of this amino acid, this building block of proteins. And now this is going to be excreted in the urine, and it is gone forever. So that's why we call it nitrogen wasting or wasting. This will give 4 calories per gram, but it takes energy to break down a protein. It's a very complex structure, so you don't even get 4 calories per gram out of it once you put energy into it. So it's not a very efficient source of energy either. We're going to finish up with the protein energy malnutritions. There are 2 that I want you to know, 2 main ones. We don't see these here in the United States. These are typically in the developing countries. And this little guy here, he has marasmus. It's a chronic protein and energy deficiency. You can see his ribs. He's got these matchstick arms. He looks wrinkled. He looks like a little old man. There's severe wasting. So from birth, he probably wasn't able to nurse. He just didn't get enough food right off the bat, didn't get enough protein or calories. Now we look at this little girl. She has a kwashiorkor, and this is a protein malnutrition. It typically develops a little later in life. This is common when she's kind of weaned off early from breastfeeding. A new infant has come along, a newborn, and now is just stuck with a grain-based diet with no other nutrients, and that's not going to give her enough of all the essential amino acids or enough protein. So she could be getting enough calories, but is not getting enough protein. What that does is, remember, protein, one of the functions of protein is in fluid balance. And what happens is that protein helps balance how much fluid is in there, and if there's not enough protein, the vessels become leaky, and that protein ends up going out into the surrounding tissues. Well, water ends up following that, and just it's an osmotic gradient. And fluid ends up leaking into the tissue, so it typically settles around the abdomen here, and then in the lower extremities. I used to look at these commercials in the 70s. I remember thinking they would always have these children who had these big bellies, and I kept thinking, how can they be starving if they're fat? Well, they're not fat. This is all fluid, or it could be a fatty liver as a result, but it's generally from fluid imbalance. And the very last thing is that there's another calculation you're going to have to do on the exam. So remember, having a calculator handy, a pen, and a piece of scratch paper might be helpful. These are all going to be fairly simple calculations. You could do them without a calculator, but you might want to have one handy. You can use your computer calculator, whatever works for you. There's 130, I'm going to take the example of figuring out the protein recommendations for a 130-pound sedentary 35-year-old female. So what do? First thing we have to do is convert pounds to kilograms, right? We don't think in kilograms. So the rest of the world does, except for we don't. So 130 pounds is 1 kilogram divided by 2.2 pounds. So you need to know that there are 2.2 pounds for every kilogram. So 130-pound sedentary female is 59 kilograms. 59 kilograms times 0.8 grams per kilogram equals 47 grams of protein. So this 59 kilogram female needs about 0.8 grams for every kilogram of her body weight. That's the minimum amount of protein she'll need a day. So that turns out to be about 47 grams of protein. Now for your diet study, you are going to see a value at the top on your intake versus goals report that is protein by weight. It'll give you a single value. And you minimum amount of protein that you need per day. So now I'm going to show you percent of total calories based on our percent range. So the DRI is what? Let's take a look at, oh, here we go. Let me go back one. We'll start with our 47 grams. All right. So we have 47 grams of protein per day, right? How many calories per gram per protein? We have 4 calories per gram, right? That's 188 calories. 188 calories divided by 1,800 calories is 10,000 calories a day. So why did I choose 1,800? Well, that happens to be the amount of calories that is necessary for a 130-pound sedentary female, 35-year-old female. Well, she's getting 188 calories from protein, and in an 1,800 calorie a day diet, that is about 10% of her calories. So what is that? Well, it's the minimum amount of calories based on total calorie intake. So it's the protein intake range, 10 to 15 up to 35%, the minimum amount. So you should be able to do this calculation, this top one. I might say, you know, 180-pound male needs, you know, how much protein does he need per day? You should be able to go through this calculation. This here, I'm just giving you an example to show you how it's done. Okay, well, this is the end of the midterm review.